Well, good evening. It's great to be with you for week 2 of our Q series. Tonight we're going to dive in at a particular issue that it's almost impossible for this issue to come up and people not have strong opinions about it one way or the other. In fact, I was sitting on the plane, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago before I really started researching this issue. And I was totally minding my own business. I had my computer on and I had my headphones in. I was watching the PBS series called Evolution. And I took my headphones out, and immediately the lady next to me turns over and she says, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm just watching this show on evolution." She goes, "Oh, the PBS one, what do you think about that?" And I started to say, you know, I'm not quite persuaded that it's true. And immediately she jumps in, she goes, "Oh, you're one of those evolution haters." Essentially, why are you guys always attacking evolution? It's beautiful, and it's so obviously true. And I said, well, I'm not attacking anything. I just want to believe what's true, and I'm not convinced. Why do you find evolution so compelling? And she said, look, if you go to any museum in the world, just walk into a museum, and you'll see right in front of you tons of fossils that scream out that evolution is true. And I said, I got a question for you. And you know what I found out? She was a PhD geologist. I said, you've studied this, obviously. You're older and you have a PhD in it more than I have at that point. I said, tell me, what books have you read? Can you name one title for me that you've read that challenges evolution? Guess what she could name? How many? None. She couldn't name one. And it was a rather awkward moment for her. Now, I want to read you a verse. Proverbs 18:17 says this: "The first to speak in court sounds right until the cross-examination begins." In our culture, only one side is given an opportunity to speak in our public schools. Hence, everybody thinks it's compelling. But once the cross-examination begins, the story looks very different. Now, the way this girl approached evolution said it's obviously true is a message that you probably get. In fact, listen to some evolutionists talk about how obviously true it is. Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous atheist in the world. He said in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, evolution is a fact. Beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt, beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. And then he said, in the New York Times, he said, it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that. Michael Ruse, a philosopher of biology at Fresno State University, at Florida State University, he says evolution is fact, fact, fact. In 2004, National Geographic had a cover story. The cover said, "Was Darwin wrong?" You open it up, and what did the inside say? No, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. In fact, this is also in popular culture. In an episode a few years ago in Friends, they had a discussion about evolution. And if anybody in Friends is going to doubt evolution, who's it going to be? Phoebe, right? Why? Because she's the dumb blonde. Right now, I don't actually think blondes are dumb. My daughter's blonde. Okay, I speak to her very slowly. Okay, so I don't want to pick on them. But Ross finds out that Phoebe doesn't believe in evolution. And what does Ross say? Excuse me, evolution is not for you to buy, Phoebe. Evolution is a scientific fact. Like the air we breathe. There's a lot of likes. Like gravity. Now, let me ask you a question. Is evolution established fact, fact, fact? Are you stupid, ignorant, insane, and maybe wicked for doubting it? Is it like as powerful as gravity? Well, the only way to really come to that conclusion is to follow the advice that Darwin himself gave. You know what advice Darwin gave about the subject? Listen to this. It might surprise you. Darwin said, a fair result can only be obtained by balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. So ironically, Darwin himself was in favor of showing the evidence for and against evolution. Now, before we look at the other side of evolution, it's worth asking the question, who cares? Why does evolution even matter? Well, this story gets to the heart of it. In 2005, the London Zoo offered a very provocative exhibit you could actually come and see. You know what it was titled? Warning, Humans in Their Natural Habitat. It featured men and women in bathing suits with green fig leaves. They posed on rocks, pretended to groom like baboons, picking parasites out of one another's hair. This is an actual exhibit in a zoo you could come see. Well, sometimes it takes a kid to point out the obvious. One kid asked this question. He said, "Why are those people in there?" You know what a spokesman for the zoo said? Listen to this. "Seeing people in a different environment among other animals teaches members of the public that the human is just another primate." In other words, if we put humans in an environment we're not used to, it'll remind us that humans are just like every other animal. We're simply a more complex primate. Now, if we're just animals, then why don't we act like animals? Why not? Scarlett Johansson, the well-known actress, was asked why about rumors of her reputation that she is incredibly promiscuous. You know what she said? Listen to this. Here's her response. She said, "I do think on some basic level we are animals, and by instinct we kind of breed accordingly." If we're just animals, then why not act like animals? Are we just like monkeys and baboons and everything else in nature, or are we a unique creation of God? How you answer that question and what you believe about it will explain almost everything you believe and how you behave in life. Really, this is one of the most important questions in life. Are you the result of an accidental, purposeless process, and hence you're just like animals? Or are you specially made in the image of a God who loves you and made you according to a purpose? It's hard to think of a more important question than that. Now let me take a minute before we go any further and actually define what evolution is. Now I won't do this because of time tonight, but I have spoken to tens of thousands of young people, and I pretend to be an atheist sometimes, and we have this dialogue. And I'll ask young people, I'll say, how many of you believe in evolution? I'm curious, how many of you believe in Darwinian evolution? Show hands. Okay, we got maybe 10 or 12 of you, fine. How many say evolution is false? Let me see your hands. Don't believe in it. 90% of you, fine. You know what happens? I won't make you do this, but I'll often find Christians shoot up their hands and say, I don't believe in evolution. I'll say, okay, can you define it for me? And guess how many Christians who don't believe in it can actually define it? Almost none. Almost none. If we're going to critique something, or at least offer the opposite perspective, we ought to properly understand what it is. Now, here's the problem when it comes to evolution. The word can mean different things. The word evolution is equivocal, meaning it has multiple meanings instead of univocal, having one meaning. For example, if you look up in a dictionary, evolution, the first thing it'll say is change over time. Evolution means change over time. So the animals that exist today are different than animals that existed in the past. We don't have dinosaurs anymore. We have fossils of animals that lived in the past. Animals have changed. By the way, you're changing every moment of your life. You're evolving. If you go like this, you're shedding cells. On other people, your hair is growing. Your body is changing every moment. Now, is this definition of evolution controversial? Is this controversial? No, everybody believes there's change over time. Then there's another definition of evolution, which is called microevolution. Now, what does micro mean? It means small, right? Microevolution means tiny or on the micro level. The famous example that Darwin gave is called Darwin's finches. He traveled to the Galapagos Islands, and he saw that there were at least 13 different kinds of finches. And he noticed on different islands they had different colors, they were a little bit different size, they had different beak length and structure. And he said as they moved to their different environments, these finches would evolve. Now notice something. Yes, there was evolution, but microevolution. The finches still stayed what? They were still finches. So you can almost call this like horizontal evolution as opposed to vertical evolution. So microevolution is when something stays within its own kind, typically defined as a species. Now third is what we're going to call macroevolution. And obviously macro means, it means big, or it means large. So macroevolution is basically all the diversity and complexity of life is a result of a natural instead of a guided process. Now it involves, if you look at Darwin's tree, his famous example, you'll see something like this. This was in The Origin of Species. And he basically said from the first simple life form at the bottom, all the complexity of life fanned out. So every living organism is in some way traced back to a common ancestor. Now people believed in evolution at least 2,000 years before the time of Darwin. Darwin did not invent the theory of evolution. Darwin gave a mechanism that people found plausible to explain evolution. What was his mechanism? He said natural selection acting upon random mutation. So what Darwin did is not come up with the idea of common descent. People believed that before him. Darwin uniquely said, you can have this whole process work by random mutations in an organism, and then natural selection will favor those that are stronger and weed out those that are weaker. That's what Darwin's theory is. In fact, one of my friends said, Darwin's theory is essentially, if you really want to understand it, from the goo to the zoo to you. That's macroevolution. All right, now let me read something to you from Newsweek and see if you can spot the confusion here. There's an article on Newsweek a number of years ago, and a girl wrote back in the comment section where they post letters. Listen to what she said. She said, they say there's no evidence for evolution. Here is some within my lifetime. My older sister was one of the patients saved by the new wonder drug penicillin, which probably couldn't save her now because microbes have evolved to the point that penicillin can't kill them anymore. That's fact, not theory. Evidence that life forms can change over time. Now, what kind of evolution is this? This is microevolution. Penicillin can develop resistance to certain drugs and evolve, but the penicillin, or the microbes evolve to resist penicillin, but the microbes and bacteria still remain what? They still remain bacteria. That's an example of microevolution. So when I talk about evolution, we're not talking about change over time. We're not talking about micro. We're talking about the grand theory of evolution by Darwinism, common descent, driven by natural selection acting on random mutation, beginning with the first life. Okay? Now, here's what we're going to do. I wrote a book called Understanding Intelligent Design with a friend of mine by the name of William Dembski. He is a double PhD from the University of Chicago in math and in philosophy. Brilliant. And when we wrote this book, our goal was to just simplify this for people that are non-specialists. So what we did, we have 2 chapters in this book critiquing evolution. So we went and got textbooks. We scoured the internet. I listened to some lectures to try to say, what are the most common evidences offered for evolution? And then we wanted to provide a counter-argument to it and show the whole story. So in the book, we go into, it must be like 10 or 12 different of the most common evidences given. Tonight, we're just going to look at 4 for the sake of time. Those are typically given in defense of the Darwinian worldview. So let's begin with one called the Miller-Urey experiment. The Miller-Urey experiment. Now, if you've looked in your textbook recently in chemistry or biology, you'll notice an experiment that looks like this. In 1953, Stanley Miller, who was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, they wanted to show how naturally you could go from non-life to life. They want to show how life first emerged on our planet. So they took this apparatus, and in the bottom left, you see there, they took all these gases that they said existed on the early Earth. They heated it up, so the gases went up through the top, and then they shocked it in the upper right, like they sent these electrodes in. And then at the bottom, they collected the chemical samples that came out of it. You know what they found? They collected amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. Now, in 1953, this was heralded as a major, major discovery. In fact, they said this simply shows that the process from non-life to life is really rather simple. In fact, you guys know who Lee Strobel is? Show of hands, how many of you know who Lee Strobel is? I'm curious. Okay, a lot of you do. Good. Lee Strobel used to teach here. He actually said, sitting in high school, he was kind of agnostic about his faith. He saw that experiment. He said, that was what tipped the scales for me to become an atheist. He said, if life can come from non-life in a natural process, then God is out of a job. That's what led Lee Strobel partly into atheism at the time. Now, Carl Sagan, famous atheist of the past couple decades ago, he said this was the single most significant step in convincing many scientists that life is likely to be abundant in the cosmos. But you remember the verse I read for you at the beginning that said, the first to speak in court sounds right until the cross-examination begins? There's another perspective about this that is often left out of textbooks. I'm going to show you 3 problems with it. And number 1, there's something very odd about this, and I wonder if any of you are picking up on it already. I have a good friend of mine who's brilliant, has his own business. In high school, he got perfect scores on math and SATs. And we would kind of debate these issues back and forth and have a lot of fun. At one point, he asked me, he goes, Sean, he goes, what would you do if scientists could create life in a lab? Would that make you doubt the existence of God? I said, absolutely not. I said, if scientists created life in a lab, that would make my point, not yours. Now, why is that the case? Because according to the Darwinian worldview, it happened totally by chance. If a scientist is involved manipulating nature to get life, then what does this prove? That intelligence and information is needed to get life from non-life. You know what's the odd thing about this experiment? This is a designed experiment. They intentionally control and manipulate the circumstances to get a certain result at the end. They control the temperature, they control the pressure, they control the flow. This is a designed experiment. The marks of intelligence are all over it. If anything, this would show that intelligence is needed to get life. But second, it actually gets a little bit worse. Do you know there's not a shred of evidence for the prebiotic soup that you kind of see at the bottom with these chemicals ever even existing on our planet? Do you see how significant this is? His whole theory rests upon these chemicals floating in these, it's kind of prebiotic soup, and they mix together and form life. There's not any evidence that this soup ever even existed at all. This is a big problem for the theory. But third, in this experiment, guess what they used? The wrong gases. They used different gases from what we know now existed on the early Earth. If they use the correct gases, guess what happens? They get nothing. They get this sludge that's actually more like sulfuric acid. The process does not work. And last, there's an even bigger problem. What is the most basic form of life? It's not amino acids, it's the cell. Even Richard Dawkins admits this in his book, The God Evolution. Cell is the most simple form of life. Now, how close are you when you have an amino acid to getting a living cell? You're not even in the right ballpark. It'd be kind of like coming up with a natural process that explains the origin of something simple like a brick. You say, oh my goodness, we have bricks? Well, that can explain how we get the White House. I don't even know if the White House is made out of bricks, but just bear with me. What do you need to go from a brick to something like the White House? What do you need? You need workers. You need a plan of where those bricks are supposed to go, in what order at a certain time. You need intelligence that's input into the system. But that's the very thing that a Darwinian worldview cannot have. There cannot be intelligence. So this process, ironically, many people, including atheists, have started to recognize that this evidence is not as strong as people once thought it was. 40 years after this experiment, Stanley Miller, the one who first did this experiment, look what he said in Scientific American. The problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I and most other people envisioned. In fact, Massimo Pigliucci, a doctorate in genetics at the University of Tennessee, an outspoken atheist, he said, unfortunately, Miller-type experiments have not progressed much further than the original prototype, leaving us with a sour aftertaste from the primordial soup. And that's an atheist. And yet these examples still show up in your textbooks. For example, I went and got some textbooks from the schools that you all go to around here in Southern Orange County. Here's an example of a textbook. I pulled it out with a direct quote. It says in the bottom right below it, this, referring to the Miller experiment, and other experiments suggested how simple compounds found on the early Earth could have combined to form the organic compounds needed for life. Now, do you think they offer any of the other side, the cross-examination? They don't. They give one perspective and state it as if it's good evidence for a naturalistic explanation of the origin of life. It doesn't sound like fact to me. Now let's look at a second one. How about Darwin's tree of life? This is probably one of the most famous images that we have associated with Darwinism. Darwin's tree of life. Now this image right here, I showed you a minute ago. On the very bottom, this is the tree of all of life on the history of the planet of Earth. On the bottom would be one simple common ancestor all of us share. And then as it moves through time, you have millions upon millions of these links tying organisms together. So as you move up the chain, you get more complexity and you get more diversity. But all of us are related back to a simple organism at the beginning. Now, Darwin said this in The Origin of Species. He said, and notice what he said about fossils. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. In other words, you know what Darwin knew? During the day of Darwin, he knew that the fossils did not fit his theory. He was aware of that, and he stated it. Now, what did Darwin believe? He believed that as we did more research, the fossils would corroborate his theory. The problem is, the more we found out about the fossils, the more it is at odds with Darwin's theory. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. If you think back to biology, you'll remember how living organisms are classified according to kingdom and phyla and class and genera and species, etc., and order. One of the things is called phyla, which you'll see up here. And all phyla is, simple term, it's referring to the body structure of a kind of animal. So you have kingdom, you have plant, and you have animal. And then within animals, the basic distinction between different kinds is according to body structure. So look at those different organisms that are up there. Think just how fundamentally different their body plan is. Like, look at the arthropods. Look at the crab up there. They have an exoskeleton. How different is that in structure from a worm? Or from something like an echinoderm, which is a starfish. Just bodily, these are fundamentally different structures. Or the chordae, of which humans fall into in fish. We have a central spinal system with, like, the ribs that go around it. Now, in Darwin's theory, should these show up at the beginning or should these show up at the end of a long period of evolution? Where should they show up? They should show up at the end, because you get the greatest divergence and diversity after an incredible amount of periods of intermediate links. So if you take Darwin's theory and you look at the present up here, what you see is this is the present with the different phyla. As you trace back in time, you should find these common ancestors, going all the way back to one common ancestor that the different organisms share. Now the question is, as a whole, what does the fossil record actually look like? Here's what it looks like. More like that. Now this isn't just slightly at odds with Darwin's theory. This is directly opposed to his view. Notice something. Remember, his was like a web where they're all interconnected. Rather, what we have at the bottom, this period called the Cambrian explosion, what that is, that's a period that's dated roughly, assuming standard old dating, 530 million years ago. What you have is you have simple life forms, simple, and then within a small period of time, geologically speaking, you have all the major phyla, or almost all of them, just show up fully formed overnight without any precursors. It's like they're just placed there in the geological column. Now, this raises a big problem for Darwin's theory. In fact, here's a way to think about it. This might help you out. Think about a football field here as an illustration. On the left side is the origin or the beginning of our planet. And scientists say it's 4.6 billion years old. Fine. They'll say 4.6 billion years old, our Earth just began. And then 3.9 billion years ago, we have the first simple life form show up. And then the Cambrian explosion was about 530 million years ago. Now, before I show you the period in which life begins, on Darwin's theory, what should you have? You should have life begin and then slowly fanning out through time. There shouldn't be any abrupt emergence of complexity. Everything should be, it should have precursors of simpler and simpler and simpler going back throughout the period of life. Now, if you compare the life on a football field with the origin of life on Earth, do you know the window in which all the major phyla show up is compared to a football field? 8 inches in length. That means for the vast majority of life, going all the way down to the 12-yard line, so 88 yards in the history of life on our planet, simple, 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 simple as you walk down this football field. And then within 8 inches, about that long, you have all of the major phyla show up in a geological instant. Now, this is a big problem for Darwin's theory. In fact, Darwin was aware of this. Look at what Darwin himself said. He said, the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the Cambrian, at present must remain inexplicable, and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views entertained here. In other words, Darwin knew about the Cambrian explosion, and he knew that it raised a problem for his theory. Why isn't that quote put in most textbooks? Stephen Jay Gould, the late paleontologist from Harvard, he put it very bluntly. He said the extreme rarity of transitional fossils in the fossil record, the extreme rarity, persists as the trade secret of paleontology. He goes, it's a secret. Only paleontologists know this. Why does it have to be secret? Then he said the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nose of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Again, evolution doesn't sound like fact, fact, fact to me. Now let's look at a third example. Third example is something called homology. What does homo mean? It means same. Assuming all of you have got that one down, even the freshmen. Now, if you look in any textbook, you'll notice this structure in every textbook I've seen. I'm sure there might be an example, but you'll notice this textbook, this picture. Do you guys recognize this from biology class? This is called homology. The point of this is you look on the left, you have a bat's wing, you have kind of like a dolphin or a whale's flipper, you have a horse's hoof and a foot, and you have a human hand. Now, right away, it's odd that they've taken different things and made them all the same size, but we'll let that go. You'll notice something. There's a similarity in structure, even in these different organisms. So the bones have a different size and a different width, but you kind of see the same structure transcending different organisms. Now, before Darwin, scientists look at this and they said the reason that there's a common pattern is because there's a common designer. A common designer used a common pattern in different organisms. When Darwin came around, he said, no, no, no. The reason we have a common structure is because if you go back in time, you will find a common ancestor that all of those shared that had that feature in itself. So Darwin would say there's kind of a precursor with this structure that existed, and as these organisms moved into different environments, that structure that was there was adapted to different environments totally naturally without God. Now, here's the question. How do you know whether similar structure is due to a common designer or whether it's due to common ancestry? Do you see the question? How do we know that simply finding similar structure in organisms is the result of a common ancestor, like Darwin said, or the result of a common designer. Now, there was a book written in the early 1990s, and listen carefully to the title. Tell me if you think he's pro or con intelligent design. It's by a man named Tim Barrett. It's called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. Pretty obvious which side this guy is on. Teaches at Harvard University. Now, he was trying to make the example and teach his students and everyone else who read his book about common design in nature as support for Darwin's theory. Now, you guys are sharp. You can pick up right away, and I'm amazed he missed this because he's obviously a brilliant person. Look at the example he uses to prove common descent in favor of Darwin's theory. He said this. He said, if you compare a 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, then a 1954 and a 1955 model, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. Do you see the irony here? He's trying to prove that common descent comes from an unguided natural process. So what does he use to make that case? Corvettes, which are designed. Do you see the irony in this? The problem is Corvettes are designed. They're not the result of an accidental process. So you know what this shows? This is a very important point. This shows that when there are common structures in different organisms, they could be the result of Darwin's theory, or they could be the result of design. But the structure in itself cannot tell us which one is true. If Darwin's theory was true, would we expect to see homology? Did you hear that question? If Darwin's theory was true, would we expect to see homologous structures in different organisms? We would. If there is a common designer, would we expect to see similar designs in different organisms? Yes. Who in here has an iPod or an iPhone? Hold it up. Hold it up. Someone who has one. Right there. There's an iPhone in the back. Now, if you compare the iPhone, are you going to find similarities with an iPod? Are you going to find similarities with an iPad? Notice why. If there's design features that work, smart designers take structures that work and apply them to different environments or to different objects. If we do that when we design things like phones and MP3 players, why wouldn't the designer of nature do the same thing? If he has a structure that works, why not use it in different features? So the whole point of this is homology makes sense from a Darwinian perspective. It also makes sense from a perspective of design. So you can't use it only as evidence for evolution. If you're concerned with following Darwin's advice, which is being fair. But again, it shows up in textbooks. Here's an example. This is the textbook 2009 called Biology, Concepts and Connections. And it says, quote, also providing evidence for evolution, anatomical similarities between many species give signs of common descent. Not a shred of even suggestion that there might be another way of thinking about the evidence. Again, evolution doesn't sound like fact to me. Now let's look at the last one, and then we'll wrap up. How about what's called Haeckel's embryos? Now Darwin knew that the fossils did not support his theory, but he believed that embryos provided the best evidence to support evolution. He said, quote, the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. This is, quote, by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of my theory. Now, he used these drawings by a biologist by the name of Ernst Haeckel. And these drawings up here, basically the point is, as you look at the top, you'll notice these different embryos. He said this is the first stage of development in an embryo, where they look very similar. And then in the middle, he said it's kind of a middle stage where they look kind of similar, but they're starting to diverge into their unique organisms. And then at the bottom, they look most dissimilar. So basically what Darwin was saying is when you have the tree of life, things look similar over the span of life on our planet, then they look a little more dissimilar, and then totally dissimilar at the end. He said the same is true in embryological development. All organisms, he said, look similar at the beginning, then they start to diverge a little bit, and then they look totally different at the end. So he said all of evolution can be seen by looking at an embryo develop. There's a few, but one particularly astute problem with this example. And you know what it is? These drawings were faked. They were absolutely faked. Haeckel used a cookie cutter to make the embryos look more similar than they actually were. So if you look at the top, that's the way Haeckel drew them. If you look in the middle, that's what those embryos actually look like at the same stage of development. Not even close. It was a fake. And again, Darwin considered this the most powerful evidence for all of evolution. It turned out to be a fake. Second, you know what else he did? He cherry-picked the examples. So instead of just taking 10 organisms at random, he chose the organisms that already look most similar and used those as his example and left out those that don't fit the pattern he wanted embryos to fit into. Again, that's called cherry-picking. Third, the big problem is, remember, he's saying it looks like this. He's saying in embryological development, they look similar and then they diverge like this. You know what you find? If you actually start at the beginning of embryological development, they look dissimilar, and then in the middle, they look slightly similar, and then they diverge again. So if anything, embryological development looks more like an hourglass than it does the tree of life as Darwin saw it. Now, you're probably thinking, how would an evolutionist respond to this? Well, let's listen to one. Here's a lady by the name of Eugenie Scott. Her job, she has this science organization that when battles show up across America and people start trying to question evolution, she gets a bunch of lawyers and they go in and they silence it to make sure that only one side is taught within textbooks. That's her job. Now take a look at how she responded when confronted with the errors in Haeckel's drawings.
And our understanding of biology in general.
It's clear that Haeckel may have fudged his drawings somewhat to look more like his ideal than they actually are. Now, does that actually take away from what we know about the relationship of embryology to evolution? Not a bit. The whole Haeckel's embryo story has been greatly blown out of significance. It is a minor footnote in the history of science. And actually, it's been known for 10 or 15 years that Haeckel's embryos are not to be relied upon. The reason why the diagrams are reproduced is because they're easily available. There's no copyright on them. It's an easy way to illustrate a point. And I would argue that the basic point that's being illustrated by those drawings is still accurate.
But if you go back earlier in development, the different classes of vertebrates look even more different.
According to Wells, Haeckel, in many modern textbooks, misleads students not just because of fake drawings, but because they leave out the earliest stages of embryonic development. What students are shown as the first stage of embryonic development is actually the mid-stage.
And very few textbooks show those earliest stages, and yet that's the whole point. It's the earliest stages that are supposed to be the most similar, and they're not. Some textbooks actually use photographs of embryos, but they pick only that stage and those classes that happen to look most similar. And they omit the earlier stages, and they omit those classes that don't look similar. So that, to me, is picking the evidence very carefully to support the theory, and that's not good science.
Wells is a critic.
British embryologist Michael Richardson in Science magazine said, "It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology." Now, when asked why she still uses them, what did she say? Well, they're easy to get. There's no copyright. It teaches a principle we know is true. Now, if the evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the Holocaust, then why do they need to use evidences that are dishonest and false? If it's so overwhelmingly true, then why don't we just pull from the plethora of evidence? Why use equivocal, and in many ways dishonest examples to teach something that has been known for a long time is not entirely true? Again, when we see both sides of the picture, evolution doesn't sound like fact, fact, fact to me. Here's two textbooks, just so you know I'm not making this up. Here's one from 2008 called Biology by Prentice Hall. And it says, in the earliest stages of development, chickens, turtles, and rats look similar, providing evidence that they shared a common ancestry. Not a shred of evidence, or at least recognition of the other side. Here's one from 2004. And notice those drawings. What drawings are those? Those are actually Haeckel's drawings. They used the faked drawings in 2004 in this biochemistry textbook. They changed the color and they set them up differently, but they used the fake drawings. And they said specifically in this how the embryological evidence points towards evolution being true. So, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? I want to read you something. My co-author on Understand Intelligent Design wrote this, and listen carefully. His name is William Dembski, double PhD. He said, Darwin was like a magician, performing far enough away from his subjects that he could dazzle them, until somebody starts handing out binoculars. Darwin's idea was a good trick while it lasted, but with advances in technology as well as the information in life sciences, the Darwinian magic gig is now up. It's time to lay aside the tricks, the smoke screens and hand-waving, the just-so stories, the stonewalling, the bluster, and the bluffing, and to explain scientifically what people have known all along, namely, why you can't get design without a designer. You can't get design without a designer. Now, tonight, we've looked at 4 examples. You got to realize, we have literally just scratched the surface. There are pages more and many, many more examples in your textbook I can't go into. But I hope you at least get the impression tonight that when somebody says evolution is overwhelming, or it's obviously true, or it's obviously fact, in the back of your mind you'll think of that proverb which says, somebody's case sounds really solid until the cross-examination begins. So what should we do? If somebody says the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, it's fact, 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 and you're insane, stupid, wicked, or ignorant for doubting it, should you A, tell them about Haeckel's embryos? B, tell them about the Cambrian explosion? C, tell them about the Miller-Urey experiment? Or D, laugh? Or E, all of the above except D, because even those who do not believe in Darwinian evolution are still made in the image of a God who loves them and knows the number of hairs on their head. Even though they deny that they are the purposeful creation of a God who cares about them, that God still does care about them. And that God still gives them the life that they breathe every moment. You know why evolution matters? It's actually found in Ephesians 2, verse 10. Listen to what Paul says. Ephesians 2:10, Paul says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. If you go back to the original language that Paul wrote Ephesians in, you know what it means that we're God's workmanship? It's the Greek word for poem. It actually means that you are a poem from God. Now, I've written 2 poems for my wife, and they're really good. Crazy skills. Now, why did I spend time writing a poem for my wife? 2, because I love her and I care about her, and I want to express something to her that matters. You know what Paul is saying? He's saying you're not an accident. God didn't just create you willy-nilly, but every single one of you, I don't care about your race, how tall you are, how smart you are, if you have a physical defect, if you have an ailment. You are a poem of the author of the universe who yearns to be in a loving relationship with you. Friends, I talk to young people, many of them, and maybe some of you in this room, who struggle with eating disorders. They struggle with self-image. They struggle with feeling like they're worthless, and they put on a smile just so everybody else thinks they're fine. One of the things I want to say is to look in their soul and say, you are the purposeful creation of a God who loves you and wants you to know that you are beautiful. And this God has a plan for your life. Amen? Amen. Well, I'll tell you what, tonight this has been quick. It's been really fun. There is no way I can answer all these. So I want to tell you a couple resources back there. And again, these are down at essentially my cost for you. There's the book I was talking about, Understanding Intelligent Design, that I wrote with Dr. Dembski. Part of it is the positive evidence for intelligent design. 2 chapters on some of everything we talked about tonight, and about 7, 8, or maybe 9 more common evidences for evolution that are all in your textbooks and responses to them. The other side. It recently got an award, and somebody said, finally somebody's taken the scientific evidence, made it interesting, and made it understandable. So if you want to go a little bit deeper in this, and I hope as a Christian every single one of you are, it's not enough to come in here and lecture and say, well, there's some, at least decently smart people who know that evolution is false. That's good enough for me. That's not. You got to know why. And you got to be able to read your textbooks, read it carefully, but also read the other side and follow what you think is true. So that's back there at my cost if that'll help you out. I also wrote a book called Is God Just a Human Invention? And I have a chapter on Darwinian evolution, but then we deal with 16 other big questions people have, like, how could God send somebody to hell? Why does God allow such pain and suffering? Why in the Old Testament does God just say, wipe out these whole people? What is going on? So we wrote this in particular for young people to help them think through these issues and be able to explain why they believe what they believe. Last, and a bunch of you have asked me about this, they're running out. We have a handful left. I wrote this, well, I didn't write the Bible, but I wrote commentary with the Bible. Don't want to confuse you on that one. A study, the Apologetic Study Bible for students. And it's just, the response we've got, I just got an email last week. Somebody said, in Iraq, a soldier was reading it and got encouraged in his faith, which just made the whole thing worth it for me. But I'll just read randomly a couple questions for you. Does the Bible endorse slavery? Does the Bible endorse slavery? How do you know you have the right books in the Bible? You ever thought about that? How do you know we got the right books? Do UFOs exist? Does the Bible contain errors? What do Mormons believe? That's a pretty important question. All right, is God male? What about Satan? Was Jonah really swallowed by a fish? Same-sex marriage, what's the big deal? Is it okay to have an abortion if you're the product of rape or incest? Friends, these are questions. We put this together, about 5 or 6 of my, actually I take that back, about 40 of us. We got together and I said, what are the questions that young people are wrestling with? And we want a resource to help them out. They're back there at my cost, between $15 and $25, depending on which one you get. So this is all to help you out, all right? I'm going to sneak to the back. I would love to answer questions, whether you agree or disagree with me. I'd love to have a conversation with you and know what you think. Next week, we're going to talk about the question, how do we know that Jesus is actually God? How do we know Jesus is God? This is a bold claim. And I think there's compelling reason to believe that Jesus was God in human flesh who walked on the earth, died, rose from the grave, and still exists today. Bring a friend next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. God bless.